up, everyone? Welcome to another exciting episode of Debating Metal. I am your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host, Chris K. And today, we wrap up our deep dive into the new wave of British heavy metal.
We're going to pick it up in the late 1980s as the scene has lost momentum and is giving way to the glam and thrash metal scenes gaining appeal in America, as well as the resurgence of the scene in the 2000s. While some bands fell apart, changed genres, or reformed with many, many different lineups, some never left NWOBHM and wave the banner to this day.
And finally, we're going to give you our big four new wave of British heavy metal bands at the end of all this. It's been a long journey, and we thank you for coming along, so let's finish this up. Chris, the new wave of British heavy metal, part 3, basically it's an episode of Where Are They Now?
To some degree, yeah, that's kind of where things are. So we're going to kind of start off with some of those, second wave bands that we talked about previously. But specifically, we're going to talk about a band that we kind of missed in the first two episodes in a way. They had a little bit different sound. So I think it's more apropos even to just talk about them here as one collective of their career.
So basically, we're talking about Raven, who started in 1974. When they were just teenagers. There was the brothers John and Mark Gallagher, and then they were joined by their friend Rob Wacko Hunter on drums. And John Gallagher was the vocalist and the bassist, and then Mark was just a guitar player. So there's only 3 of them. So that's pretty cool. I think they've always been a trio, if I'm not mistaken.
Aside from before they released anything, yeah, they've been a trio.
Okay, so they were formed in Newcastle, England, 1974, when John and Mark were just teenagers. But they didn't really pick up any major steam until the new wave of British heavy metal kind of hit. But they were a little different. And even though their first album, I would say that Rock Until You Drop, that came out in 1981, that came out in the midst of the new wave of British heavy metal. But you could tell there was something a little different from them. A little faster, a little edgier in a way. And then in 82, they came out with Wiped Out, which at that point now they're definitely more along the speed metal kind of vibe, but still there's elements of the new wave of British heavy metal, but a little bit faster. And then All For One came out in 83, and that really kind of set them apart, and they really weren't new wave of British heavy metal. And the funny thing about that one is All For One got them a distribution deal in the United States through Megaforce Records, oddly enough. And that brought them over to the United States to do a tour with newfound band Metallica in 1983 for the Kill 'Em All For One tour. Which, if anybody is familiar with that, Metallica just put tickets for sale recently for a show, one-off show in not Fort Lauderdale, but it's somewhere over there at the Hollywood Hard Rock Casino in, I guess, Hollywood, Florida. And they're doing a show with Raven, and it's going to be comprised from Metallica for only Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning songs. So that's pretty cool. So I wonder what Raven's set's going to be like, but that should be pretty interesting. Anyhow, that's where Raven started going off and becoming a little bit different. They were a little bit speed metal, a little bit heavier, a little bit edgier. Unfortunately, a few years later, they come out with Stay Hard. They signed to Atlantic Records, and Atlantic decided, hey, we want you to be a little more commercial. We signed you as this band, but we think you could be this band. And there we go again. Record companies fucking shit up and literally almost put Raven in the grave before they even started, because it completely changed their sound. It completely changed everything about the band. Almost kind of brought them back a little bit to the new wave of British heavy metal, but it almost destroyed the band from the inside out at that point.
So Stay Hard, to me, is not that bad. There are more glam elements on it, but it's not as bad as what would follow with The Pack Is Back, the preceding year, or proceeding year, I should say. But, Stay Hard, you can definitely feel like it's not the same. Up to that point, there's a lot of people that call them the godfathers of thrash, because even though they didn't play thrash, that speed metal kind of led into what would become thrash in a lot of ways. But you hear albums like Stay Hard and then The Pack is Back, which almost ruined their career. Really, you said it almost put them in the grave. That's pretty accurate. So up until that point, I mean, I think All For One to me is my favorite of their albums at that point. But Rock Until You Drop and Wiped Out are both great.
Oh, no, those albums are awesome. And actually, I mean, I went through them the other day and listened to them. And you and I were talking about it briefly, and I discovered that they re-released the albums on vinyl, and basically like in all original packaging, which is absolutely the coolest thing I've seen when it comes to these reissues, because this is like legitimately taking something from way back in the day and doing an exact replica of what it was back then and releasing it in today's standards, to the point where there's an Obi strip so you don't see a UPC on the back. I mean, it's super cool. I'm hoping that it's not a matter of like remastering the album or anything like that. Just leave it the way it was. And if that's the case, these are excellent reissues. But continuing on with Stay Hard, The Pack is Back, and then the Mad EP that came out a little bit later, I actually have Stay Hard. And I thought that was a pretty good album because I wasn't that familiar with Raven in terms of like the Wiped Out, All For One, and Rock Until You Drop era, that original era of theirs. So it was catchy. Like the song On and On was catchy. Stay Hard was catchy. It was not, to me, it wasn't like glammy or poppy or anything like that. It was just different, and
it has some glammy elements.
Yes, it had glammy elements to it.
It's not a bad album at all.
No.
Really.
And so I thought it was
different.
Pretty good myself, listening to it. But when The Pack is Back came out, I was like, yeah, no, they went in another direction. They went in another direction that I just didn't quite get. And so when they did the Mad EP, you could tell, I believe that the cover has, I can't remember, I don't think it's Rob Hunter on the front. It's one of the Gallagher brothers. But you could tell just by the cover, it seemed like something was different about the band. And then you could tell that they were kind of going back to their original sound. But it was obviously you put it on and you could tell, okay, yeah, so Raven's kind of doing what they used to do. But after that, I kind of lost when they got dropped by the company. I think a few years later, and Rob left in '88. I kind of lost touch with the band at that point. I knew they were around because I had seen some of the albums come out here and there over the years, but I just never really got back into them.
I mean, the Mad EP is really good. I think that was, definitely a return to the more aggressive sound. I actually enjoy that one a lot. Life's a Bitch is really good. And then a lot of their material afterward I think was really good. They had, up until that point, they had just those three core members. But then Joe Hasselvander joined them in 1988, replacing Rob Hunter on drums. And Joe Hasselvander, if you're familiar with Pentagram, I think some of you listeners might be, was their original drummer. So he stayed with the band until, I want to say it was like 2018, 2019, when he had a heart attack. And then he didn't want to continue on. He just said the touring life was too much. And they replaced him with Mike Heller in 2020. So, that's understandable, kind of wanting to get out of that lifestyle if it's detrimental to your health. But I think it's really cool that in their career, they've really only had just a few members of that band.
Well, yeah, and part of that's due to two of them being brothers, so they're...
But there's another set of Gallagher brothers that don't like each other.
That's right. There is. Yes. But, I mean, not all brothers always get along, but what I've noticed is if the brothers do get along, they stay tight forever. You think about the Van Halen brothers. You talk about Lizzie Borden, who the vocalist, Lizzie,
his
and his
guitarist brother, right?
No, his brother Joey is the drummer.
Is the drummer? That's right. Okay.
Right. Then you got Raven. They've been together, for a long time. And then yes, there's the opposite. You got Chris and Rich Robinson from the Black Crowes, who basically for the longest time couldn't stand each other, and then I think for money they got back together recently. And then obviously, what's their face? Oasis with Liam and Noel Gallagher.
Yeah, the kid that don't even want each other on the same planet.
That's going to be a little tough. I'm just saying. Unless one of them goes to Mars, that's going to be a little tough.
It's becoming more and more feasible, but we probably will not have an Oasis episode, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, not having that. So anyway, Raven was pretty cool. I would be remiss if we did not mention them, only because they were part of that scene, but they splintered off. So where are we going from here?
All right, so let's talk about Tokyo Blade. We mentioned them in the last episode. So to kind of recap, so they broke up, and then they had a disastrous release with No Remorse. The only member of that band at that time was Andy Bolton, which was one of the guitarists. And then they released Burning Down Paradise in 1995. So this is a kind of a return to some degree, because it's made up of members of a band called Pump House, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, and then Tokyo Blade. So Alan Marsh returns on vocals. He's the original vocalist, and John Wiggins returns on guitars, original guitarist. So you have Andy Bolton, Alan Marsh, and John Wiggins, along with Colin Riggs and Mark Angel. And now those guys come from Pump House, who was the band for the lead singer, Alan Marsh. So you have basically a combination. The record company said, you guys should work together again and, basically combine these two products. So Burning Down Paradise is not bad. But there's a release in 1998 called Pump House. So that's actually the band Pump House, but it was released under Tokyo Blade because they wanted the name out there. They didn't really think it would be successful with its actual name.
Now, did Pump House include Alan Marsh and John Wiggins?
So it included Alan Marsh, Colin Riggs, and Mark Angel.
Okay.
And so Jez Lee was the guitarist, and Ian Attila Marshall on keyboards. So it's a completely different band, but what ended up being half of Tokyo Blade, and thus they released it as a Tokyo Blade album. So it's not, if you're a Tokyo Blade fan by chance, this is not technically a Tokyo Blade album. And so the next one that was really released was 1,000 Men Strong in 2011, then Unbroken in 2018, Dark Revolution 2020, and Fury in 2022. So they've been releasing stuff ever since. Now Alan Marsh did leave for one album and then returned again in 2018. So they kind of still have. Actually, I want to say in 2011. That was like a full Tokyo Blade reunion to some degree, because Andy Wrighton came back and Steve Pierce, the original drummer. So you had like a full kind of return to form, except for that was the album that didn't have Alan Marsh on vocals. So, but he did return after that, and ever since it's been kind of like a classic lineup reunion. So that's, I understand that, and it's tough logistically when you're not a huge band sometimes to get everybody together that was meaningful, impactful on that band. But it's nice to see that they've kind of come back to, I would say, the better days, the Tokyo Blade or Night of the Blade lineups, So that's cool. Give the newer stuff a listen, definitely. It's not, I wouldn't say as good as those really classic albums, but it is pretty good, and the instrumentation's a lot better than some of that junk in the middle.
What I've noticed about a lot of these bands is that you have two ways of approaching not the reunions of it, but the continuation of the bands. And you have the approach of, we need to remain in this course, this manner of recording, this manner of writing songs, because this is who we are from 1980 on or whatever. And then you have the bands that try to update their sound, try to update their recording techniques, try to update their songwriting. And to me, they kind of lose focus. Somewhere in the middle is the best place for a lot of these bands to be. And we'll talk about a few artists that are able to do that. I think if you steer too far away from where your original sound was, you're going to lose the fact that you were that band. You're just now become any other band at that point. And I think Tokyo Blade was just all over the place. You know, to me, there's really no one set sound for them because they've had so many different singers back and forth. You know, the guitar player changed. You know, the band has changed. So it's kind of like, yeah, they're all reunited now, but do they sound the same as they did back then, or do they remotely come close to being the same type of band as they were back then? I don't know. You know, it's
close. Being that Night of the Blade has been re-released with Alan Marsh's original vocals before the actual release. So he recorded vocals, then they replaced him, put Vicky James Wright on vocals. So the reissue has both versions, I believe.
Right.
So now you have the first album, second album, and then this newer stuff with the essentially the same lineup they had from Night of the Blade. And that's kind of cool, and it does feel similar. It feels like they kind of went back to basics, listened to what they started as, but it's still a modernization of that sound. So I think it's more accessible if you are a fan of those earlier albums. But there's a chunk from 1985 to like 2010 or so, 2011, that's just passable. Just pass it. Don't even really try unless you're just curious.
See, and to me, that's what messes up the legacy of bands like that. You know, if you got a period of time because there's so much fluctuation and so much things going on in terms of personnel, that you're messing up the legacy of the band. But
I mean, you could say that for Black Sabbath because they
Black
did
Sabbath
the same thing.
is different. I mean, every era is different. They sound completely different. All three of them, four of them, whatever you want to call it.
But every era has its own fans. So
correct.
Reality is reality, and it's subjective. But the difference is Black Sabbath still had some good music in all those times.
That's true. All right. So next up, speaking of these bands that kind of change sound or not change sound, one band that's very interesting in all of this is Grim Reaper, or as it ended up being called, it was Steve Grimmett's Grim Reaper. You know, going all the way back to, you know, starting in 1979, and then they released their three, you know, 80s albums, See You in Hell, Rock You to Hell, or See You in Hell, Fear No Evil, and then Rock You to Hell, in that order. You know, the band had their heyday, you know, so then they kind of disbanded at the end of that because they kind of they morphed into a harder glam metal kind of band, trying to keep their foot into the original new wave of British heavy metal Grim Reaper sound. But then they was like, we need to become more commercial. So they were keeping the evil part of it, but still trying to be glammy at the same time. They ended up, you know, disbanding in '88 for all sorts of record company and management reasons and all that stuff. But in 2006 they reformed because basically people wanted them. The fans wanted them to get back together. They knew Nick Bocott was doing those columns for Guitar for the Practicing Musician or Guitar World. I can't remember which magazine it was. But so they knew he was around, and then, you know, with Lionheart, with Steve Grimmett being in Lionheart, he kept hearing, "Hey, get back together, reunite." Problem was,
people in the crowd yelling, "See you in hell," you know, stuff like that.
You know, and that's cool. You know, that's a really cool feeling if you're the vocalist or if you're Steve Grimmett. But Nick Bocott lived in the United States, so that made a true reunion kind of impossible. Although I disagree to that extent. I don't know if it was just because of straight logistics and they wanted to get into the same room. I mean, dude, one of them could have taken a trip to England, or the other one could have taken a trip to the United States, work out something, and they say, okay, look, let's put together a new album. You can send the tapes back and forth, and then that's it. I mean, I don't know. It seemed to me like Nick made it more of like, I don't really want to be involved, but
he didn't want to be involved unless he was touring. Like, he wanted to do that, but I don't think he 100% wanted to be involved. Like, it was just, I think if maybe they were touring the U.S., it would have been a little different.
Right.
But, yeah, to some degree, I think it's just one of those things where it didn't work out, and he was like, "Yeah, well, you just tour," you know,
which was nice of him. So he allowed Steve to reform the band under the moniker Grim Reaper, but then he had to add Steve Grimmett on it because Nick was not involved.
But
so that's
it
fine.
wasn't even that he had to. He even suggested it because he didn't want to fool anybody, which I think is really cool. You know, some of these bands, they want the name, they just go under the name, and it does fool people. They go and they go, well, where are the guys? You know, where who are these people?
Yeah, but then again, you look at bands like Wasp. It's just Blackie Lawless. It's always been Blackie Lawless since the mid '80s. So there's no fooling.
No. That's different, though, because that's the vocalist. And you go, okay, it would be weird to go see Wasp, and it's just like, a guy that played on one album, and you're like...
Well, that's like, Stephen Riley's L.A. Guns. It's just a drummer.
Yes, exactly.
But this is Steve Grimmett. This is the voice of Grim Reaper. I don't think he should have... He should have just called it Grim Reaper because he's the voice and he's the main guy.
But he's a good guy, and he understood... Guy. So
I get it. So like I said, I have no problem with that. So they came to that agreement. So they released an album in 2016 under Steve Grimmett's Grim Reaper. Album's called Walking in the Shadows. I put it this way. That's not a bad album. And it continues the legacy that they created in the 80s, which was great because it is exactly what I was saying before about Tokyo Blade. There was so much, dysfunction basically that you don't know if it's really Tokyo Blade. And in reality, it wasn't. It was a Pump House, album. So you look at this album, Walking in the Shadows from Grim Reaper, and you say, you know what? This sounds like Grim Reaper. This has songwriting like Grim Reaper. This obviously has the vocalist from Grim Reaper. This sounds and is Grim Reaper. That's pretty cool, And even then, it's a more modern recording, but there's something about it. You say, oh, yeah, this is Grim Reaper. Now, that being said, they released another album in 2019 called At the Gates. You can tell at this point that Steve's voice is changing. I don't know. Maybe his balls finally dropped after 40 years. I don't know what the deal was, but it was the tone was low. And that that's age. That's not a thing. I was just joking about the balls dropping. His age caught up to his voice. Not that it was bad. He still can sing, and he still had good vocals, but it was like I guess like a lot of modern day singers, all the bands tuned down because he can't reach that pitch on a regular basis. That was At the Gates. Doesn't take away anything from the songs and the recording or anything like that. It's a pretty decent album. Just for whatever reason, you say to yourself, this is not exactly a Grim Reaper type album.
So it may have had to do with his health problems because if you remember, he fell and he broke his leg and they had to get it amputated, and that was in 2017. So in between 16 and the album from 16 and 19, there's that difference of his lifestyle, health, etc. So it may have affected his vocals. I still think it's a really good album. I actually really enjoy both of these. But yes, Walking in the Shadows I think is a bit superior to At the Gates. But you could tell like the guy was still doing what he wanted to do up until his passing, in this year, right?
Yes, so, I mean the unfortunate side for all of this is that Steve Grimmett ended up passing away just a few months ago, really, and so that brings an end to Grim Reaper in that regards, because I doubt Nick Bocott's going to do anything again with it. And it's just sad. So there is from what I understand, an album that was being finished in the works, or some music at least that was in the works that's being finished. I know a live album just came out. So stuff like that is it's sad because you think they could have continued, and he tried and he did the best he could. And like, I agree with you. Yes, the accident may have had some effect on his vocals, may have had some effect on his attitude, and you can tell, but again, nothing wrong. The album was very decent for what it was, so it's a shame that he ended up passing away at this point in time in their career. Grim Reaper had a very distinguished 2 periods of time, because they were definitely, between 1988 and 2006 is a long period of time they were inactive.
Yes.
So the fact that they reformed and people were still into them was pretty cool. I think it was they did not hurt the legacy with these 2 albums, Walking in the Shadows and At the Gates.
Not at all. Did we mention that Nick Bocott played a show with them when they first came to the U.S. in 2014?
We did not.
So I think that's pretty cool. So like when they did make it over to the U.S. for the first time in decades, basically, their first show in the U.S., Nick Bocott did play with them. That's pretty cool. That
is very cool. That is very cool. So you could tell there was really no animosity between Nick and Steve. It's just one of those logistics type of things. They had moved, each of them had moved on in their lives in different paths, but they crossed paths at some point again and made good on it.
So I'm gonna mention 2 back-to-back pretty quick ones. There's not much to talk about here, but if you are a fan, there has been several releases since their resurgence in the 2000s, and this is Cloven Hoof. We mentioned last time, so not much of a career early on, and we saw a lot of upheaval with different members, etc. But basically, Cloven Hoof would reunite in 2000. And by reunite, I mean one member came back, and then they would, have a revolving door of members. Russ North, we mentioned on the previous episode, was a vocalist. He came back for one more album, and then would kind of come back and forth in the band. I think he's been in and out, but only recorded one more album. So since this time, they've recorded 5 albums, including one this year, but they do have their fan base, and they do have a little bit of a resurgence since the 2000s. So if you enjoy Cloven Hoof or just want to find some of these bands that we don't talk about as much, I think it's worth noting. It's not bad music. I've listened to a bit of each of these albums, and I'm like, okay, this is entertaining at least, but you might find something different in it that I don't. So definitely worth kind of just looking into, because there is, especially early on, that first album, there's some pretty good stuff there. So any thoughts?
The other stuff was good. I'm not really into the latter stuff. It's just it's almost like a nameless, faceless band at that point. You got the original bass player. It's one of those things where if you don't have the original singer or the second singer or whatever it is that made the band famous, it's like, what are you doing it for?
Well, that's the thing, is they had a different singer on every album, so it's really hard to
right. So
nail down.
Me, exactly, and things like that, it's kind of like you're just using a name, but because in reality, it sounds different every single time.
Yeah.
So I to me, that's one of those things where it's kind of like it's a nameless, faceless band.
It's hard. It's hard to get into, but if you do find something in it, there's a commonality of the sound of each album, and I think that's the only thing they have going for them in that regard. Where, like, if you're a listener and you can find that, like, say all the members were the same except for a different singer every time, you would still find probably some commonality in the sound of the band, other than the vocalist, obviously. But that even is tough, even if you had all the same members every time. But regardless, the newer incarnation, I think, is a little probably easier to find that rhythm, find the similarities in each of the albums, because for the most part it's been similar members of the band. But anyway, moving on to one more that we'll kind of go over pretty quickly, Angel Witch. So Angel Witch had most of their like big part of their career in 1985, 1986. They released Screaming and Bleeding and Frontal Assault, and I think both of those albums are really great. Obviously, they had their first album, Angel Witch, before that, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Title track. Sorry, that title track is just so catchy. So it's a band that I've pretty much enjoyed everything they've released. And these two albums that they released in 2012 and 2019, to me, are no exception. They're really kind of from two different lineups, two different eras of the band, and you can really think of Angel Witch as Kevin Hayborn's project because he's really had different members in every incarnation of it. This 2012, As Above, So Below, was their first album since 1986, and that's a huge gap. But again, Kevin Hayborn had been active in different bands, different projects, etc., all that time, so he never really went away from music. This is just him returning to his side project, essentially. And it's the first that he did vocals on since the first album, because David Tatum was vocals before that, due to Kevin's issues with his vocal cords. But he had solved it by this time. He puts together two different incarnations of the band, and then releases Angel of Light in 2019 as well. And I actually really enjoy both of these albums. They're a lot heavier than some of the stuff that came up before. His vocals I like a bit more than David Tatum's, so I think these are also definitely worth checking out.
I listened to him, and As Above, So Below is pretty cool. To me, it sounds like Angel Witch, but a more modern version of it.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. I mean, when you have your main songwriter and singer and guitar player, right there, you understand this is his project. This is his baby. So it's going to sound like something that he put together. So it's going to sound cohesive in that regards. Okay. And so that's what makes it sound like Angel Witch. The album is pretty good. The songs are pretty good. The only thing I could say is not good is the drum sound. It sounds like they took the drums from a garage and they went ahead and said, "Oh, we'll use those tapes," and then they went into the studio and did a regular recording for the rest of the instruments. It's just kind of weird sounding. I think the drums could have been better. To the point, like the snare almost sounds like it's broken, type of thing. But that's just a nitpicking. The songs themselves are pretty good. The rest of the recording is pretty decent. So, and like I said, the album and the songs are done well. It's Angel Witch, modern Angel Witch, and then Angel of Light. Interestingly enough, goes along that same veins. It's even lower budget in my opinion, sound wise. I think they expanded a little bit more on the Angel Witch sound, or on the Angel Witch galaxy, you want to put it that way. Their whole realm is now a little bit wider. He expanded his songwriting in Angel of Light, which is pretty good. Right, that's what I was going to say. There's another dimension to Angel Witch now with this album, which is pretty good. I mean, you think about it, very similar to Grim Reaper. There was a long period of time that Angel Witch, even though they were on and off together throughout the 90s, they disbanded officially in 1990, and the band itself reformed in 97, 98, then in the 2000s, but they didn't record anything since 1986. So it's a big period of time where there was nothing going on, music-wise. They just toured for the longest time as Angel Witch, basically living off the legacy. But these two albums don't hurt the legacy. They actually expand it, which is pretty good. So I'll go with that. Going on from here, Girls' School. I think Girls' School is definitely a band that we need to talk about in this regards, because they're kind of like hidden. They're kind of like tucked away in the corner somewhere, but yet they still exist. So we talked a little bit about Girls' School last time. They were kind of one of the moderate successes. They still are. They formed in 1978. We've talked about them last episode. They have basically been from that point on a working band all the way up to now. But in the 80s, they tried to make, or in the mid 80s, put it that way, they tried to make it in America. So they tried to be a little more commercial. They tried to be a little more glam. They tried to be more accepting of what was going on over here to kind of break their new ground in the United States, which is always difficult. English bands, that's their goal. They want to make it in the United States. You can make it in Europe and you're okay, but if you make it in the U.S., you've made it. And so, bands like Motorhead and Iron Maiden and Def Leppard, all those bands were making it in the U.S. And Motorhead, I put that loosely because Motorhead was kind of like so steady, but yet they still had a really strong following in the U.S. And since they were friends with Girls' School, that's why I kind of mentioned them. But Girls' School tried, and it just failed. Their experiment to become more commercial in the U.S. failed. So they retreated and went back to England. And basically from that point forward, they have remained a working band. They have remained a recording unit and have recorded several albums over the years. And they've only, between being a 4-member band, they have maintained two out of the 4 members, so half the band has been the same the entire time, which is really cool. And some of the members have just basically been going in and out. The same 2 or 3 or 4 additional members have just come and gone back and forth. So they don't have a very long list of members in the band, maybe 6 or 7, which is pretty cool. So this bass player who, Tracy Lamb, she decides that she wants to leave, so she gets replaced by Gil Weston-Jones, and then she decides to come back, and then, it's one of those things where it's the same person coming back. They just keep taking a break. I like that because, you know what? It keeps consistency. You have the same chemistry, and so they have been working together over the years. They've put some decent music out. I think for the most part, Girls' School has literally they never really veered too far off the beaten path that they had created for themselves, songwriting wise, musically, and touring wise. They've basically been a European act mostly this whole time, and they've not really strayed too far away from that. And like I said, musically, they haven't gone to do a symphonic album, or they haven't done anything where they wanted to do a concept album. They've just been themselves, and that's pretty cool. On the downside to it, they haven't released any new music since 2015. But the music they did release, like I said, is Girls' School. You're gonna pick it up and you're gonna hear it, and you say, "Yep, that's Girls' School." So that's the good thing. Bad thing is they are still an active band, but they haven't done anything new musically since 2015.
Yeah, there was one thing I want to mention was, so they did their 21st anniversary album in 2002. It was called Not That Innocent. And basically they were trying to get back, the original lineup. They're trying to do, a kind of big grandiose album. And the production ended up taking a really long time. And during that time, Kelly Johnson, their guitarist, had to leave the band because she actually was diagnosed with spinal cancer. So she had been diagnosed in 1999, but the effects had really taken a toll on her, and the album wasn't released until 2002. I think there was like 5 years of production on this album. So the other thing was that Tracy Lamb was actually recording on it as well, but ended up leaving and was replaced by the original bassist, Enid Williams. So kind of interesting that they had such a back and forth with these members coming in and out of the band. But this album, it's kind of sad that it didn't work out as well, because it is not that bad, but it's kind of all over the place. There's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different thoughts, but it's one definitely worth checking out because it does have a lot of original members coming back into it. In some degree, like, it's not the mess that Kiss's Psycho Circus is, but in some capacity I almost feel like it's a similar concept. Have these guys come back, but they only record on a couple songs here and there and this and that, and it's a little bit overproduced, it's a little bit overdone. So kind of similar story in some degree, just not as much drama.
Exactly. All right, so what do you got?
Let's talk kind of quickly about Praying Mantis. So Praying Mantis, we mentioned in the previous episode, or actually on the first episode that we did on here, and then they didn't really have anything in that time in the middle. But then in 1990, this idea comes along. We're going to reform, and we're going to bring on two former members of Iron Maiden, and that's Paul Di'Anno and Dennis Stratton. So it's not really, it's kind of questionable. Is it an actual band with these members, or is it just a project? And they're going to record some music or live stuff, or they're listed as official members, but it's got Tino Troy, Chris Troy, and then they've got Bruce Bisland on drums. So they released Live at Last in 1990. Like, we've been waiting all these years for the live Praying Mantis album. I'm a little puzzled by the name, but give it a listen. It is really interesting. You have a little bit older sounding Paul Di'Anno here. You've got Dennis Stratton singing on some songs, which he has a really nice voice, actually. Playing some versions of Lionheart songs. Iron Maiden stuff, right, is on there.
Oh, yeah.
And then, obviously, Praying Mantis. So it's kind of an interesting album, to be honest. You got, I thought was a really cool version of a song that I didn't really think much of before, which is called Dangerous Game from Lionheart. And I was very surprised by this release as a whole because I wasn't aware of it existing for the longest time. But it's kind of a cool, live album. All these years we waited for Praying Mantis, but
I listened to it the other day, and I'm like, to me, like you said, is this a project? Is this a band? To me, this was forced upon all the players involved, at a suggestion. And yeah, someone said, "Oh, that's a good idea," and so they decided to do it. In reality, the execution, as fun as it was, and as fun as it seemed to be when they made this recording, it's not, to me, it's one of those things where it's like, is this Praying Mantis or not? What is it? Because they played these Iron Maiden songs. They have nothing to do with Praying Mantis.
Yeah.
They did these Lionheart songs that have nothing to do with Praying Mantis. So it's kind of like trying to give the fans a big, party for stuff that they were fans of. That's great. When in the grand scheme of things, that's great. But in the niche that is Praying Mantis, I don't think it helped the legacy whatsoever. Obviously, they went on to do a shitload of albums throughout the 2000s or late 90s and 2000s, but there's so much upheaval. I don't think there's any continuity. I don't think there's any particular path that this particular band created. It's just like, all right, you're in the band. Oh, no, you're in the band. This singer's in the band. That singer's in the band. That to me is just bullshit. I'm not big into having 1 million members in the band and every single member changes. It's just nuts. And yeah, so there's one guy that everything rotates around, but is it really, is it really the band? That's my problem with it.
So just to kind of elaborate on what he's saying, so we have, over the course of 10 albums, you have Dennis Stratton on lead vocals, Colin Peel on lead vocals, Gary Barden, Tony O'Hora, Doogie White, Martin Freeman, and John Kuipers. I'm going to guess that's how to say that. And I apologize if I got it wrong. But that's a lot of lead vocalists for 10 albums. That being said, the first four that in 1990 up to 1998, they are not bad. I listened to Predator in Disguise. I think that was probably my favorite. I had Dennis Stratton on lead vocals. But then A Cry for the New World, To the Power of 10, Forever in Time. I think all of those have some merit to them. I didn't listen as much to the stuff that came later, but I did give each one a try with the different vocalists. Doogie White, you've probably heard him in Rainbow, a great vocalist. Oh, and there's John Sloman as well. So basically, The Journey Goes On, it alternates between Doogie White and John Sloman being the vocalists. So
even worse, that just adds to my annoyance.
I understand that, but at the same time, like, there's different time periods too. So from 1990 to 2003, I think that's one like incarnation of the band to some degree. The only thing they really changed back and forth was the vocalist. 2003 they broke up, then 2008 got back together, and then kind of found more of that like consistency since 2008. I would say specifically since 2015, that lineup has pretty much stayed the same. So it's worth a try. It's worth finding something, because here's the other thing that I always find about bands. Sometimes you can find one album from a band that you just love, but you don't necessarily like the rest of their catalog. So you might find that in this. I think Predator in Disguise, to me, is the only one that I really would maybe recommend, like, checking out. Everything else is kind of negotiable, but Praying Mantis, not a huge band. There was one kind of somewhat influential album. That's about it. Check out some of the rest of this stuff. You might find something you like, probably maybe in the early 90s. That's about it for me.
I mean, look, on every one of these albums, there's probably something that somebody's going to like. I mean, we can't take that away from Praying Mantis. The problem is that, you sit there and say, okay, well, this is Praying Mantis. Well, that's Praying Mantis. Well, that's Praying Mantis. And they're all so different. And that's what kind of like throws me off with this whole thing. It's like, like listening to Live at Last, right? They were playing the Iron Maiden songs pretty good. I mean, you're talking about Iron Maiden songs that were basically off the first album.
Yes.
I think they did one song off of Killers. And for the most part, you're listening to it, oh, okay, this sounds like Iron Maiden. But the fuck, you're not there to listen to Iron Maiden. I mean, I get it.
But I don't think so. I think that concert, they said, because they marketed it as Praying Mantis. However, they said Praying Mantis with Paul Di'Anno and Dennis Stratton. So you're getting a mix of all those things. Even though Dennis Stratton was a member of Praying Mantis, bringing in Paul Di'Anno, I think, is where that marketing came from, right? So
yeah, that was just a cash grab.
So to me, if they called this Praying Mantis with Paul Di'Anno and Dennis Stratton, a celebration of new wave of British heavy metal or something like that, it would make more sense, but it doesn't necessarily sound as good. Live at Last, I think, is a bullshit name, but what else are you going to call it? I don't know. So
Live. You just call it Live.
Praying Mantis with Paul Di'Anno and Dennis Stratton live, or the original Iron Man live, or something like that. I don't know, but it's right. Still an album worth checking out. It just, there's never gonna be a day or a name of this that makes it like really attention grabbing and something that's gonna stand out to people. So it is what it is.
I get it. Yes, it is what it is. I get it. You have Paul Di'Anno, you're going to sit there and say, hey, we should do an Iron Maiden song. 1, 2 tops. Okay? Because, like, for instance, Sammy Hagar joins Van Halen, okay? Yeah, they played a couple of Van Halen songs. I mean, excuse me, a couple of
they
Sammy
played all
Hagar
Sammy
songs.
Hagar songs. And just
it's all Sammy. They did I Can't Drive 55 and...
There's Only One Way to Rock.
There's Only One Way to Rock. Okay, they didn't go into playing half of Sammy's old catalog. Well, I'm in the band now. We got to play. No, you're in Van Halen, so very similar. Dennis, Paul, you're in Praying Mantis. I'll give you 1 to 2 songs tops as Iron Maiden. I'm not going to sit here and listen to half a set of Iron Maiden I will, because I'm sure I enjoyed it because that was what it was at the time, a celebration of those guys. But to sit there and say, okay, we're gonna put this out as a Praying Mantis album, it's not. And that's where, yes, it's a celebration. I get it. Finally, after all these years, we finally got the long-awaited live album that we were looking for. But, it's just, to me, it was pointless. But for them, it was a cash grab. I get it. We move on. Fuck Praying Mantis.
Wow. Okay.
That's just stupid. You got 10, how many vocalists in 10 albums? Come on. What kind of and none of them came back. That's the funny thing. They're all different. It's like,
well,
what the hell is that?
John, the last guy, came back for 3 albums. So, and then Tony O'Hora did a couple, I believe, right? No.
No, he did too. John Quippers, or whatever his name is. He's the last vocalist, right? So he's done 3 albums. Yeah, I'm assuming he's on 2018 Gravity and Catharsis. Yeah. Okay. But, come on. It's just like a fucking different singer every single time. And it's just, come on. I mean, and then different drummers. So that means the drum sound changes on every album too. So it's just, come on. I'm done. All right. Tigers of Pang Tang. Let's move on. Tigers of Pang Tang. You know what? Of all the bands in the new wave of British heavy metal, they had the coolest name. I'll give you that. And they formed in 78, as we talked about before. They lasted up until 84, then decided to come back again the next year, reformed again till 87, and then were defunct until 1999, and then they came back, and they've been together ever since, playing new music and recording new albums. That I can sit there and say, you know what? That is noble that they continue to make new music. The problem with that nobility is that the new music, up to a certain point, wasn't that good. I could leave everything after the first breakup all the way up until now, or all the way up until not now, 2016. That period of time was just not very memorable when it comes to Tigers. I mean, they reunited in 99. So they released Live at Wacken in 98. They had Jess Cox as their vocalist, Rob Weir as a guitar player. So, you have this reformation. That's great. And they come out with this album, Mystical, in 2001. And it seems like a band that's stuck in the 80s that is trying not to be stuck in the 80s. So let me read it off exactly like I wrote it. Sounds like a band stuck in the 80s trying not to be stuck in the 90s. So, and it's very weird that way. And they got some good riffs on the album. The arrangements leave something to be desired. The album itself is a little disjointed. It seems to me like it's a collection of songs from different time periods. Even though it was recorded relatively all at the same time, you could tell it was not done in like a consecutive studio session, for like a month. There's just too many variances in the sounds to sit there and say, oh, this was all done at one time. Whatever someone tries to tell me, I'm not believing it. But
I mean, that makes me think of Cinderella. You remember Cinderella? I think it was their 3rd album. They recorded it in like 4 or 5 different studios. Yeah, mm-hmm. Same exactly. Kind of thing.
I mean, in some cases it works, and the reason being is that you have the budget to do that. Like a Cinderella, like a Kiss, or some bands that record it in several different studios.
But it can sound disjointed, though, and that's the thing.
In some cases, it can. If you have the songs, there's a difference between having the songs all demoed out, so you have 10 songs you're going to record, but because of time constraints or you have to go on tour or do something, you end up having to go to different studios. But you have your core demos already done, so you go to the new studio, you set up the drums, you try to put it in the same way, or you hope that you got all of one thing recorded at one studio. So that, let's say you did the 10 demos, you got the 10 basic tracks recorded at one studio. So now you have to do guitars at another, vocals at another. That's different. Okay. But when you're you have songs already written, and you go to this one studio, you record 3 or 4 songs, and then you end up going to another studio to record a couple, 2 or 3 different songs that you didn't have written the first time. That's when it becomes disjointed, and that's what this album sounds like.
That's what I was referring to with Cinderella, because on their third album, they did like bluesy songs, then they did their kind of like 80s metal-ish sounding songs, and then there was some other stuff.
Are you talking about the third or the fourth?
The third album, not Still Climbing, but the one before it.
Okay, the one before.
So they mixed a few styles and things like that, and they deliberately went to different studios and record. Like if this was going to be a bluesier sounding song, they went to a different studio to record that. And the album to me sounds very disjointed. There's a lot of good material on it, but it sounds disjointed. It doesn't sound cohesive. So I'm like, I felt kind of the same way about what you're talking about, where everything just kind of feels like it's almost like 3 different albums put together in some way, you know? And the recording doesn't... like, when you're listening to an album, and you're listening to it from beginning to end, and it all sounds like it was recorded in the same place, then there's this continuity there where your brain accepts it, and you're listening to it, you're not thinking about it. But when each song sounds different, and their recording quality sounds different, etc., and it just throws you off, you know? Even if it was really good, there's still something that's, like, disconnecting there where you're like, this doesn't sound right.
Exactly. And this album, Mystical from 2001, is all over the place. And part of the issue is you continue on. In 2004, there's Noises from the Cat House. 2008, Animal Instinct. 2012, Ambush. Okay, again, here we go. Different vocalists on almost every album. And so there's no continuity in the band. How do you expect there to be continuity in the sound?
Well, from Animal Instinct on, they've had the same vocalist, Jack Melee or Male, or I don't know how to pronounce that last name.
I don't know either. It's Meal, whatever.
It does matter. I mean, he's not a bad vocalist.
Well, No, he's not a bad vocalist. He's not a bad vocalist whatsoever. He's in the band. So we'll say his name is Mealy because there's 2 L's and an E at the end. Jack, welcome to the band. He has kept the continuity going. The thing that's interesting about Tigers, they finally got it together. They finally put together a really good album with the self-titled Tigers of Pang Tang in 2016. It's a pretty good album. I like it. And it's also recorded well. So you've now have basically come full circle, and you have brought this band, deservedly so, into the modern era with some good songs, for essentially trying to keep the legacy of the band intact, although the legacy is a little out of whack. In 2019, they come out with Ritual. Not a bad follow-up. Okay. A little bit of upheaval after the album, but that's okay. It's a guitar player and bass player. That's, for lack of a better term, they're replaceable. So you have some structure now in the band. Here's the thing that bugs me about fucking vocalists in general. Jesse Cox, the original vocalist for Tigers of Pang Tang, decides and gets a bug up his ass to say, hey, I'm going to put together my own version of Tigers of Pang Tang, and I'm going to call it Jesse Cox Tigers of Pang Tang. And then it puts this band together, doesn't record a single lick of new music, okay? And is basically living off the legacy of a band that existed when he first joined the band and has a couple of albums. And that to me is like, you talk about living off your legacy. We could do a whole new episode on all these new jackasses out there that are trying to jump and get on the bandwagon of their own old band. Problem is that Tigers of Pang Tang was so disjointed for so long that there is no legacy for Jesse to join in on until after that point, because when they released Tigers in 2016 and Ritual in 2019, that's when they finally got it together. And it's like, why?
Well, I mean, to some degree, I get it with some of these guys where they're playing the songs that, like Dennis Stratton, right? It's not like he came up and he's doing a tour of Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, you know? He's playing the shit that he played on. That's unlike the guy from AC/DC, what's his name? Dave Evans. Dave Evans plays, Highway to Hell.
He plays Highway to Hell.
He plays Highway to Hell, and he was out of the band for about 45 years by that point. So, I get it when, say, for instance, the Pantera tour that's coming up. People have mixed feelings about it, but at the end of the day, those guys, they were Pantera. It's not like there was any time period when they weren't in it of those songs that they're going to play. You're not going to hear Phil singing stuff from, the first Pantera album, with the glam sound, but like you're going to hear it from Cowboys On. And they have the right to play those songs because they are their songs. So I get that.
But at least he wrote the lyrics,
Yes.
At least he wrote the lyrics for it.
Yes. Well,
I get that.
Okay, Sebastian Bach.
Not...
Sebastian Bach tours doing songs from the first two Skid Row albums. But he didn't necessarily write those lyrics, but he made those songs.
Right,
so
he made those songs famous. He has every right to tour. He was part of the band that made those songs famous. But also, he's the vocalist. I get it more. Yes, Jesse Cox was the vocalist. Yes. I get that, okay? But there's a difference. Sebastian Bach, that album sold, 6-7 million copies? Everybody around the world knows it. Jesse Cox, they sold what? 100? 500? 1,000? Whatever it is, on the first album of Tigers of Pangtang, Metallica knows who they are, but you're living off of a bullshit legacy because we
don't know if he's living off of it or he's just going.
No, he's not making a fucking dime off of the old shit. I'll tell you that.
He's just going and touring, and maybe he has a different job or so. I don't know. I doubt he's living off the legacy of that.
Well, when I refer to living off the legacy, I'm not talking about in terms of a career and making money. I'm talking about the fact that he actually decided to have the balls to call up promoters and say, hey, listen, I got a band named Jesse Cox, Tigers of Pangtang. I'm the original vocalist for Tigers of Pangtang. I have a whole new band, and we're going to be singing songs off the first album. Okay. So promoter goes, cool, I could sell out a 500-seat arena.
I get it.
It's like, that to me is just it's a wild concept, and we're going to talk more about it in a band coming up in a little bit. But you know what? Look, let me not take anything away from Jesse Cox or Jess Cox, whatever you want to call him. It's just at that time, all those years later, to form a band after the band was completely dysfunctional for so many years. Okay, to sit there and say, you know what, screw it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to become the band. I mean, is his relationship with who's ever running Tigers that bad that he couldn't just rejoin the band?
I mean, they have a singer.
I don't know.
They have a singer in place. They're not just going to fire.
Like singer's never been fired. They've had 37 singers. They can fire the guy.
They have one that's consistent. The guy's been in the band for 14 years at this point. Longer than Jess Cox was ever in the band.
Longer than Jess Cox, exactly. Longer than Jess Cox. Anyway, it's just one of those things that for in many, many, many cases, that is something that really grates my nerves. Like Dave Evans singing. I mean, you know what? He has every right to sing Highway to Hell because anybody can sing whatever song they want to sing. They can as a cover. Okay, I get that. Pick a different band to do a cover of, because that's the one weird thing about it. It's like you're living off of AC/DC's legacy off the fact that you sang on one song, maybe two, before the band became famous, before the band even signed and made a record deal. Well, they had a record deal. He sang those two songs as a single, and then they brought in Bon Scott. So he's not even part of the famous part of the band at all. And then all these years later, he's going to live off of playing all the songs that they played at the time, which was essentially the first album. And then, I'm going to go into do an encore. I'm going to go ahead and sing a cover of that same band. I don't know. I just, he really irritates the shit out of me when it comes to that stuff. So we could talk more about Dave another time. Tigers, I said the last two albums are really cool. I think those are, they've kind of found their niche now. So
yes, sir.
All right, we move on. Enough bitching about Dave Evans and all those other people.
All right, so we're going to move on to Diamond Head. So Diamond Head, we kind of talked about last time. It's kind of a hit or miss thing with them. Their first album is absolutely amazing. I think a lot of people see that as a starting point to, what would come with bands like Metallica, Megadeth, and beyond, really. Like, a lot of those guys were really, truly influenced by Diamond Head. They tried to reform in 1993. Sean Harris and Brian Tatler got back together, and they brought on Dave Mustaine to produce one song, I believe. Tony Iommi played guest guitar on one song. And then, it's not a bad attempt. It's just, for me, it doesn't really like do it. They didn't quite recapture anything from before. It's all right. It's better than the last album, Canterbury, by far. But it's just, it was an attempt. It didn't quite work out. They weren't happy with the project after that. Ended up breaking up in 1994. Then they'd reform in 2000. This time it was really Brian Tatler's project. He wrote most of the music, so that makes sense. Has Nick Tart on vocals, Eddie Moohan on bass. He kind of played a couple tracks on the previous album, and Adrian Mills on rhythm guitar. It's not bad. All will be revealed. It's getting a little bit more momentum, I would say, by that point. Nick Tart stays on vocals through the next album, What's in Your Head, and then Diamond Head in 2016. So that, to me, is where the band kind of found their sound again. Rasmus Bon Anderson replaces Nick Tart on vocals. I really like his voice. He's got a great voice. They released Coffin Train in 2019 and Lightning to the Nations 2020. So it's a re-recording entirely of Lightning to the Nations with this new singer. And to me, it sounds great. It's more mature. Some of the solos, I think, sound even better. Obviously, recording quality is better. And Rasmus's voice is fantastic. So it's not, the original still has its place in history, and it's not replacing that to me. I think it's just kind of showing like, hey, we're around all this time later. This is what we can do now with this band. And yes, it's a cash grab to some degree. I get it. 100% get it. But the difference is it still has to be good. And it is good. So to me, Diamond Head, they didn't really do anything, that's too substantial. I think these last three albums, including the re-recording of Lightning to the Nation, have been really good. Everything in between, it's worth checking out just because if you love that first Diamond Head album, it's nice to see, their path, where they came along. But, really it's that first album and these last three that are going to be what you want to check out. Everything in between is kind of like, give it a try, see what you like. But Diamond Head, to me, has found a sound, has found something that kind of takes them back from being just one of these middling bands to something that maybe never will find that ground, but is more substantial, and as metalheads we can really enjoy.
So, as you're talking about Diamond Head, and a stream of consciousness came into my mind. I was thinking about one thing leading to another, and there's so many different thoughts came into my mind about Diamond Head in general. So let me let me touch upon each one. The first thought I had was if Sean Harris and Brian Tatler had retired after making Lightning to the Nations, or their first album, they probably would have been better off, being that they wouldn't have tarnished the Diamond Head legacy with albums like Canterbury and Death in Progress. And I say tarnished because they're really not very good albums. I mean, Death in Progress has its highlights, but in essence, it's not a very good Diamond Head album. The first album, Lightning to the Nations, which technically for Sean and Brian was a demo, okay. It is better. It obviously, that is what is their legacy. All right. So that's the first stream of consciousness. They would have been better off. But okay, so they didn't do it. So they recorded another album, they recorded another album, they recorded another album. And it's like, all right, you've never touched even remotely close to what you did, that magic that you found the first time. Okay, I get it. You want to be a band. This is what you are, but you're catering to everybody around you as opposed to catering to yourself. That's another stream of consciousness of thought. Then finally, when you touched upon Lightning to the Nations 2020, and I like that album a lot because it does bring that album into a modern recording. It's a new version of songs that should have been technically re-recorded on their first album. They only did 2. And the vocalist, it's got a deeper register, so it kind of makes those songs a little bit thicker in that regards. So it sounds really good. There's the one thing that not a lot of us fans know, and I know a little bit about it. We've touched upon it on the episodes, or episodes in the past, is the music business itself, right? There's a reason why all these bands that have re-recorded full albums of early music, there's a reason why that happens. Every single band has a different reason per se, but they're all kind of related. Def Leppard, they had their battle with iTunes or streaming in general. That's the reason why they re-recorded, but yet have yet to release it fully. Re-recorded all their greatest hits, trying to mimic exactly what they did in the studio back in the day. They came really close, but for some reason the energy wasn't there. Okay, Twisted Sister re-recorded still Stay Hungry, and they should have. They're fat and full. They didn't really care. It didn't have the same angst. Kiss re-recorded some of their best hits for for a re-release. So Kiss had their reasons because they did not want to give money. Literally, they did not want to give performance money to Peter and Ace. So they re-recorded with Eric Singer and Tommy Thayer. So their performance and sync rights that go to radio stations, or that they get from radio stations and stuff like that, changed, and so that they're not giving certain money out to certain people. So they have an ulterior motive. Same thing with Ozzy trying to re-record the first album, but so every band has its reasons for doing what they do when it comes to re-recording. Exodus redoing Bonded by Blood, different reasons. Mm-hmm. So Lightning to Nations, to me, they have their reasons. Now they're getting legitimately paid on whatever it is that they get from this album. Back then it was a demo, it was released, but it sold a few thousand and it kind of went bootleg from there, and then they reissued it years later. It did not have the same effect, as it did originally. So they probably didn't make a lot of money on it, but it wasn't until Metallica made them famous again that they actually had a career, had a life, and stuff like that. So that was all those things are going through my mind while you're talking about the band. And I like the band for who they are now, and I like the band for who they were back in 1980, 81. But the band in between, they lost their way so much, and then they finally kind of put it together later in the late 2010s or in the 2010s that, I don't know, I could take them or leave them, I guess, in that regards. So I know that was a long explanation of their albums. But that was the stream of consciousness I had while you were talking about that.
I get it. You reiterated a couple points that I had already said, but that's
yeah. No, I mean it's one of those things because you're talking about it, and I'm trying to listen as hard as I can, and at the same time, there's so many different thoughts that are just popping up back and forth with that, But because there's songwriters out there who have written a song or two, made it big from the person who covered the song or the person who recorded their song that was like certain singers, like I forgot, was it the guy who people who record the people who wrote Hit Me With Your Best Shot that Pat Benatar ended up singing. I don't think they actually recorded as a band. They were just songwriters, and she found the song and recorded it.
I mean, that happens a lot.
Right, that happens a lot. So, she made them very rich. She became rich on that as well because she gets performance rights and she gets album sales. But as songwriters, they became very rich. And basically, I think they wrote one or two songs after that, but never really did anything. And they retired off of the fact that Pat Benatar made them famous.
There's the dream.
Exactly. You write one song and have someone else record it, and then you never have to worry about anything. So that's really cool. That is basically Harris and Tatler. Metallica made them famous. Megadeth made them famous, although Megadeth didn't really do much in terms of recording. Metallica was the one who recorded and made them famous.
Well, yeah. I mean, that early sound of Metallica, they wouldn't be famous without Diamond Head either. Let's be realistic. It's a symbiotic relationship in a lot of way because Metallica passed off Diamond Head songs as their own songs for a while. So it's it's give and take, and it's worked out, I think, well for both of them. The difference is Metallica had that talent to kind of continue on and continue writing great music all these years. So, it's not really taking a whole lot away from Diamond Head. I'm glad they're putting out better music now, but you're 100% right. The songs have to be there, and in the middle period of their career, they just weren't. But definitely check out those last 3 albums, and if you've never heard the first album, you're missing out. Check that one out as well.
Okay, so we've gotten through all the moderate successes and of the bands that made their way through the new wave of British heavy metal, made their way through the end of the actual scene, and and have the not, I don't want to say reimaging, but the reinvigoration of the scene that happened in the 2000s. A lot of these bands, came back with a vengeance, basically, and said, "Hey, I want to make money off of this too somehow. This whole resurgence of the scene. I want to be a part of it. So this is where we're at now." But there are a couple bands that we're going to talk about now who have basically maintained their fame throughout this period. One more famous than the other, but the next band we're going to talk about is Zaxxon, and they really have not stopped this entire time, which is really cool. I really, really think that is one of the cool things. Very similar to Girl School. They never quit. They never gave up. They continued moving forward. And in Zaxxon's case, very forward. They have grown with the times as they have changed. Still keeping their foot in the original new wave of British heavy metal to some degree. I mean, there's a shoe in there. A lot has changed, but there's still a grounded effect that roots them all the way back to this. They, saying that they've maintained a steady workflow is ridiculous when you think about all the albums that they have released over time. I mean, in the 80s, you're talking about they started with, from the point that we're talking about, the mid-'80s, Rock the Nations, Destiny, Solid Ball of Rock, Forever Free, Dogs of War, Unleash the Beast, Metalhead, Killing Ground, Lionheart, Inner Sanctum, Into the Labyrinth, Call to Arms, Sacrifice, Battering Ram, Thunderbolt, Inspirations, and now most recently Carpe Diem. I mean, that's nuts to think about all those albums through that entire time period.
Yeah.
But they did it, And yes, they've had they've had lineup changes, but they've had two
Pretty
guys
minimal,
that have been in the
honestly.
band. Relatively minimal. The drummer changed twice, but it was the same person back and forth. So it's essentially three people or two, definitely two people from the beginning.
And Nigel Walker only left for one album and then came back. And that's one thing to keep in mind too. But
Nigel left a couple times and came back.
Yes, he was replaced by
Nigel.
another Nigel. And I thought that was interesting.
And then was replaced by George Michael.
Yes, but
that's where he was all that time. He's playing for Saxon.
George Michael, but yes. So ever since 2017, though, they've had a consistent lineup, which I think is really cool too. Solid albums, and we talked about them before, like just heavier and heavier. That's the other thing. So I've really enjoyed Saxon's latter career. Their early stuff is awesome. The 80s stuff was really good. But for me, as like a guy who likes heavier metal, man, the stuff ever since has just been awesome. So
yeah, I mean, there's, put it this way. I mean, the fact that Amon Amarth came to Biff and said, "Hey, we'd like you, to be in this song, Vikings and Saxons," is pretty cool. And he did, to listen to someone singing death vocals, and then you have Biff doing his regular Saxon vocals, is really cool, dichotomy in that song, which can be found on the latest Amon Amarth album. Excuse me. So, I want to point out a few things on a couple albums. In 1995, they released an album called Dogs of War. And I don't know what happened during the recording of that, but someone, I don't know if they did it like overnight sneaking and no one figured it out, but someone just dropped all the bass frequencies. And there's absolutely zero bass frequencies on that album. I don't know what the hell happened. It's worse than a demo in that regards. But it's very interesting that there is almost no bass frequency. You can hear the bass guitar.
Metallica snuck into the studio, and
no, man, it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that. It's just like, because there's bass drum on Injustice for All. There's you can hear bass lines throughout. The problem is that this one, they removed the frequencies. So like if you're listening to the bass line, it just sounds like the pick. If you're listening to the drums, just imagine taking, your eraser and tapping it on a desk, eraser on a pencil, tapping on that is the way the drums sound. And the snare is a little bit higher just because that's the way snares sound. It is so weird of a recording.
Yeah, it's not good, to be honest.
No, it's not.
But there's some other really interesting stuff that's going on at this time. And that's that Graham Oliver does not appear on the album, and there's a reason why that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But this is essentially it's like a album of upheaval, I would say.
Yes, yeah, there was a lot time for change, to put it that way. Next album, Unleash the Beast, they kind of got back to sounding a little bit more normal in terms of recording sound, but. Again, one thing we wanted to reiterate about this is that the songs themselves are still pretty decent. They're pretty good. And like I said, you just mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about Graham Oliver in a second. The one thing I really like, last year, 2021, they released a covers album called Inspirations. And I got to tell you, I was, when you start thinking about an old band wanting to re-release or record songs that inspired them, you start thinking, oh shit, they're going to start, recording 60s tracks that no one really cares about. I got to hand it to them. They released a pretty good covers album. It's very diverse in the artists that they chose. There's, they picked a song from Motorhead. They picked a song from AC/DC. They picked a song from the Beatles. They picked a song from Jimi Hendrix. But the one that really stands out to me was they picked a song from Toto, Hold the Line. That's probably Toto's third biggest song that they've ever released. And I say third because obviously we all know about Rosanna in Africa. But
Hold the Line really stands out to me. Like, when I think of Toto, that's the song I think of, honestly. So it may be different for everybody.
Well, and I say that really because, Rosanna and Africa was so huge.
Oh, yeah.
But Hold the Line is such a, like you don't really think of Toto because to me it's like a semi-heavy song. It's killer riff on that song, and it's so catchy. But it was very interesting that they recorded that. And then the other thing that they recorded was a song called Evil Woman. Now, up until today, I was this years old, or today years old is the modern term for it, when I discovered that that's not actually a Black Sabbath song. I was like, what? What do you mean? It's a song that was recorded in 1969 by a band named Crow. Released as a single. It was actually a top 100 hit. I think it reached number 69 or 68 or something like that in the top 100 charts, Billboard 100. And Black Sabbath picked up on it, recorded the song the same year, released it the following year, I guess in January of 1970, as their first single off of the album Black Sabbath. Now, if anyone here listening in the United States has the first Black Sabbath album, they're not going to find that song on it because it was not released in the United States, not until 2002. If you were in Europe and you have a European import version of Black Sabbath, you'll have the song on there, which is amazing. I had no idea that was not a Black Sabbath song until today.
I actually
recording
didn't
this
either.
episode. And I when I heard the Inspirations version last week, I'm like, oh, this is a cool, I like this version that they did, and I love the Black Sabbath version, but I was blown away by the fact that it's not a Black Sabbath song. It's got a killer bass line on it, and I was surprised. It was an American band named Crow. So that's interesting. But getting back to Zaxxon, as you referenced in 1995, there was a little bit of upheaval. And why don't you go ahead and take it from here as to what we're talking about?
So basically, Graham Oliver and Steve Dawson formed their own side band called Son of a Bitch, which was originally Saxon's name before they recorded music. So they had changed their name over to be more marketable. Makes sense. It was former members of Saxon in the band: Graham Oliver, Steve Dawson, Pete Gill, and then Nigel Durham, who had briefly replaced Nigel Glocker, would later be in the band on drums. So they released Victim You in 1996. It's got its merits, but they've kind of been inconsistent from there. They released a Regarding Landed. It's a hard way to say that. So basically the RE: Landed. Live album in 2000. Then Rock Has Landed. It's a live in 2002. That's a DVD. So it's not like really new music or anything like that. They did an interesting one that I wanted to bring up. So it's called The Second Wave, 25 Years of New Wave of British Heavy Metal. That was a album that they did with Girl School and Tigers of Pantang in 2003. So basically each member or each band had 5 songs on that record. It's interesting. It's worth checking out, but this is 2003 Tigers of Pantang as well. So I believe that's Tony Liddell on vocals. Girl School is Girl School, so they're always going to sound that way. And I just think it's really odd that they went with this version of Saxon, so Oliver Dawson Saxon. It's another live album in 2003, and then finally they released another actual album called Motorbiker in 2012. Then another live album in 2014. So to me, this is more of a living off of your legacy kind of band.
So I have a beef with Graham Oliver and Steve Dawson, or Oliver Dawson Zaxxon. I have a huge beef with this. But first, they sound like Zaxxon. Go figure. Okay. You're talking about basically an alternative version of Zaxxon with a different singer. It worked for them. The singer that they chose for Son of a Bitch was a guy named Ted Bullitt, and for the most part, he sounds like a cross between Biff Byford and Udo Dirkschneider. Okay, so you combine Biff and Udo, and that's the sound you get with this guy Ted Bullitt. Doesn't sound bad. It sounds like Zaxxon. Okay, so that's the good part about it, I guess you could say. The part I have issues with is that you've got former members thinking that they can use the name Zaxxon of an established band. Now, yes, they were part of that established band, but you left. You were replaced. Okay, and then they think they could use a name to form an alternative band, and not alternative style, but a different band. Okay,
they're playing up there like Nirvana and shit. Like,
so they think they can make this alternate band, and find success. They found some success. They found touring success, if you want to look at it that way. And success is relative to what you want to claim. Okay. In this particular case, they tried to steal the name outright. Okay. They went to court, and because Zaxxon had been established, and even though no one actually owned the name, and these Oliver and Dawson tried to basically register the name, because Zaxxon had the pre-existing history, and they basically in the end accused Oliver and Dawson of trying to take the name under not false pretenses, but with ill will. So the Zaxxon name was given to Biff. He has it now, so they had to come up with Oliver Dawson Zaxxon. Okay. They have recorded some original music, obviously with Son of a Bitch, and then later on with Oliver Dawson Zaxxon. The bulk of their live show is based on early era Zaxxon. Okay, so my beef with that is you have created a band. Now you have two different Zaxxons out there. Okay, one with the original singer Biff Byford, who basically has formed his legacy and has continued to do it each and every year since 1979, 78, whatever year it was that they formed. Okay, 77. And then you got two disgruntled people. And I say two because, yes, they had other members from Zaxxon, but they may or may not have been disgruntled. It may have just been, hey, we're making a band. You want to join? We're doing Zaxxon. Oh, yeah, okay, sure. And then you try to basically pawn yourself off as the real band. I don't like that. I think that's shitty. Dude, you had your career, you decided to quit for one reason or another. You didn't get along with Biff anymore. You didn't like the direction that they were going in. Maybe they were getting a little too heavy. You wanted to stay NWOBHM. Who knows? You have your name, your personal name that people know you by. Come up with something original. Okay? Yeah, you could go out there and you could still play Zaxxon songs, but do you really think that you're going to have tremendous amount of success or create a new career under this old thing and be that much more successful? Get your own identity. It's just like, come on, seriously, get your own identity.
I mean, they're not the first ones to do this. I mean,
no, they're not. And I have a beef with all those other fucking people too. It's like, get your own fucking identity. You know what? You know who I admire for that? You know who I admire for that? Danzig.
Mm-hmm.
Danzig. Glenn Danzig could easily have lived off of the Misfits, right? But what did he do? Okay, you got Glenn Danzig, who basically, leaves the Misfits and comes up with Sam Hain, okay? And then that falls apart, and I believe he takes Chuck Biscuits with him. I think Chuck Biscuits was in Sam Hain at the end there. And they make Danzig. And he creates his own identity. He creates his own brand, his own business. And at sometime, he may or may not have played a Misfit song here and there. I don't know. I saw them a couple times in concert. It was mostly Danzig. But the bottom line is he went and created his own legacy. Okay, he did not live off of the Misfits. And that's admirable. Who else? I mean, for the most part, Ace Frehley is Ace Frehley, and he went and made Frehley's Comet. And yes, in concert, he played Kiss songs. Everyone knew who Ace was.
Yeah, but he didn't just live off of that. I mean, like Rob Halford, right? Rob Halford, when he did his Halford.
Rob Halford. He did Fight.
He did Fight.
He did Halford.
But he also played some Judas Priest stuff, but those were his songs. But it wasn't only that.
Right, exactly. But he had Halford. He had 2 albums. He had Fight. He had 2 albums. And not only he had 2 and 1 album.
That's
but that never got played live. But the bottom line is that he, through Fight, through Halford, he played Judas Priest songs. But he never purported himself to be,
Judas
Rob
Priest.
Halford's priest. He didn't do KK's priest. Okay? He just... KK is basically trying to do that so that people can remember. I think people know who KK Downing is. Okay? I'm sorry. I think people know. And it's who else? Who else is out there? Tom Kiefer. Tom Kiefer. He doesn't go, I'm Tom Kiefer Cinderella. No. He just plays as Tom Kiefer. His entire set, except for like 1 or 2 songs, is Cinderella. But you wouldn't know that it's Cinderella, but it's Tom Kiefer, right? So, he went out. Yes, he's the vocalist, just like Rob. He's the vocalist, but he didn't necessarily purport himself to be the ex-singer of Cinderella, the ex-singer of Priest, the ex-singer of the Misfits. Okay? They went ahead and forged their own legacy. Ace Frehley, even him, Frehley's Comet, went out and forged his own legacy with that band. Released first album actually was technically an Ace Frehley solo album called Frehley's Comet. Then the second album was called Second Sighting. The band was named Frehley's Comet. Okay, he went out and did his own thing while also still playing Kiss songs at the end of the show because that's what people wanted to hear. Okay. I'll give all those people credit, but Graham Oliver and Steve Dawson and Oliver Dawson-Jackson, screw you, okay? Figure out your own freaking legacy. I guess that rant is over.
All right.
I mean, do you agree with me or disagree with me?
I don't know all the circumstances behind their split, so I would like to know a little bit more about that, why they split so angrily.
That's like Dave Mustaine. He's pissed off still to this day.
But he doesn't call himself, Dave's Metallica.
Exactly. He made his own legacy. He forged his own career.
I get that. I agree.
What is heavier than Metallica? What is Megadeth? Okay,
so it is. It's heavier than Metallica.
Yes. But that was his intent. I'm going to do something heavier, faster. Than Metallica. I'm going to name it Megadeth. And that is what he did. He achieved it. And you know what? Kudos to him.
Exactly. No, I understand where you're coming from. I'm a little curious, and maybe we'll do an episode about Saxon in the future where we talk more about it. I don't know, or just mention it in the future. But I'd like to do a little bit more research about what happened in 1993, 1994 that made them split. So,
I mean, we all know. Yes, we all know what happened to Steve Riley from LA Guns. He got fired. Mm-hmm. The only way that Tracy Guns, the actual guy who started LA Guns, was going to come back to his own band, it was if Steve was gone. Okay?
True.
And Phil Lewis, who's the original singer for LA Guns, came back because he was with Steve Riley all that time, but he reunited with Tracy and they dumped Steve. Yeah. And Steve's all butthurt. He goes away and I'm gonna make my own band. Well, no, that's not true. Let's put it this way: he got offered, so he says, he got offered to do some festivals in Europe, okay, as LA Guns, and he tried to purport himself off as being LA Guns. I'm sorry. Singer, bassist, guitar, nobody from LA Guns. Then all of a sudden you got the LA Guns drummer. I'm sorry, you did not create the LA Guns sound with your special drumming. Okay? So that kind of shit pisses me off because that is bullshit. You know what? Come up with your own band and, look, I'll give it to him. Adler's Appetite. Steven Adler. it's a play on words. At least he didn't go out and say, I'm going to be Steven Adler, Steven Adler's Guns N' Roses, because Axl would have shoved him into the ground at that point. But, so he comes up with Adler's Appetite and basically plays
Guns and Adlers.
But everyone knows that Steven Adler was the drummer for Guns N' Roses. We all know his history with drugs and all the problems that he's had, and the stroke that he had and all that stuff. But you know what? He needs something to hang on to. I give him that credit because he's done some original music as Adler's Appetite, mostly living off of the Appetite for Destruction legacy from Guns N' Roses. But you know what? It's a play on words. If very similar to Oliver Dawson-Jackson playing on words with their albums, Rock Has Landed. It's supposed to be a takeoff of, The Eagle Has Landed. No. I get that. I'll give him that much, but even Steven is pushing the boundaries of that living off your legacy, but he's not trying to purport himself off as a version of Guns N' Roses. He is trying to celebrate the fact that he was in Guns N' Roses. It's a big difference.
And yeah, they've been very kind to him over the years, which I appreciate, because the guy's had his problems, and it's when you're that addicted, etc., then it's a blessing that he's even alive today, and I think even the other members of the band view it that way, but they don't want to play with him, and I get that too.
Yeah, I get it.
But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, and then lastly, to touch upon one of these guys living off of legacies that's not really doing too much in terms of living off a legacy, King Diamond. Okay, he left Merciful Fate, and he said, "You know what? I'm going to make my own path. I'm going to make my own band. I'm going to call it King Diamond after me." Right. And he did. And he's had a very successful career for himself. And he actually went back to Merciful Fate. They're playing now. They're touring the United States now. Okay. And that, that's, again, noble. Make your own career.
That was his band from the beginning, though, too.
But he could have easily have left and said, I'm going to go ahead and make my own Merciful Fate, because he's the most unique singer out there.
No, I agree. I'm just saying, so he has a little bit more rights in there too. He could have, but he didn't. He did his own thing.
I mean, all these bands, if you think about people who have left the bands, I mean, Jason Newsted could have easily gone and said, I'm going to go ahead and make Jason Newsted's Metallica. Bullshit. Who are you going to kid? You can go around playing, you can call yourself Chop House and play Metallica songs. That's great. Do that, but
I think he should have called himself Injustice for Jason.
Yeah, exactly. All right. We have one more band left to discuss, and we kind of all know who that's probably going to be, but we're going to both talk about it because it's that kind of band. Why don't you go ahead and start it off?
So let's talk about Iron Maiden. I'll kind of take things up into the 2000s, like before the 2000s, I guess, and then you can take it from there. So Iron Maiden, obviously been around since 1975. We talked about up into Somewhere in Time last time. So starting off with Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, you've got basically the classic lineup of the band: Bruce Dickinson, Dave Murray, Adrian Smith, Steve Harris, and Nico McBrain. This was the last album with that lineup, however. But it's a great album. I'm an absolute fan. This, to me, is the last great of the the Bruce era. That's the best way to put it, right? Because I'm a fan of No Prayer for the Dying. I'm a fan of Fear of the Dark. But Seventh Son of a Seventh Son was the last one that was just kind of flawless from beginning to end for me. No Prayer for the Dying comes out in 1990. You've got Yannick Gers replacing Adrian Smith on guitars. Adrian just kind of wanted to move on to a new thing. You've still got some of his writing on the album, but I get it. It was time to move on at that time. Fear of the Dark comes out in 1992. Another pretty great album. But the band is dissolving, and the tour that accompanies the album is, let's say, not great. It's still good, and the fans still view it positively. But from the band perspective, it's not great because you have, after this point, you have you have Steve Harris saying, "Well, Bruce wasn't really in it. You know, he was going through the motions, this and that." And I think that's debatable because you can listen to the shows, you can still find them, and he still sounds great. So from their perspective, you know, they've got inner band turmoil, etc. They can view it how they view it, but from a fan perspective, it might be a little different. Well, then 1995 rolls around. In between this time, Bruce has left the band, and they've replaced him with a singer called, let's go British, a singer called Blaze Bayley. So Blaze, very different sound. You know, he's the guy that they felt was the right fit for the band, but he had some vocal issues trying to do Bruce Dickinson's vocals. Who wouldn't? You know, who's going to match Bruce? It's going to be hard to find somebody. And it definitely was in 1995. The X Factor, Virtual 11, they've got some good songs on them here and there. There's a couple that we've both come to like. So you have The Klansman and Sign of the Cross. Those are songs that they even played recently on the show that we went to see. So there's some good stuff on there. Future Real, I think, is a really good track as well, and Bruce re-recorded that later. But, you know, this was a tough period. They went from being an arena act, you know, massive band, down to playing club shows. And that's happened to a lot of bands since in the metal scene because metal is not as prominent as it used to be. But for a band as big as Iron Maiden was and a band as big as Iron Maiden is now, it was a tough time period. But then 2000 rolls around and Bruce returns to the band.
I was at one of those club shows, by the way. I went to see Iron Maiden with Blaze Bayley on I want to say it was the X Factor tour, but I can't be certain. But yeah, that seeing Iron Maiden in a small club is a very different experience. As cool as it was, you expect Iron Maiden to have that big grandiose stage show. This was literally just them with a small Eddie backdrop and Eddie comes out. They didn't have the whole Eddie at the end with the backdrop, you know, sticking out, you know, all air Eddie, you know, whatever he is, like an air balloon. It's very, very strange to see him like that, but it was cool at the same time. In 1999, Bruce Dickinson returned to the band. In 2000, they recorded their reunion era album, if you want to call it that. Bruce Dickinson returned, as well as Adrian Smith returning. They recorded Brave New World. Amazing, amazing album. We all know that. So the reunion era began in 1999, and it's kind of weird because they put out a hidden track on the Ed Hunter Greatest Hits CD and CD-ROM game. The hidden track is Wrathchild with Bruce Dickinson on vocals. And the way they did it was they literally just said, here, redo the vocals. They took the original track from all the way back in 1981 and they kind of remastered it or remixed it, and then they put Bruce's vocals on it. That was the first thing to basically start up the reunion era of Iron Maiden. In 2000, they released Brave New World. 2003, Dance of Death. 2006, A Matter of Life and Death. 2010, Final Frontiers. 2015, Book of Souls. And just recently, last year, they released Senjutsu. This era of Iron Maiden is nothing but sensational. It's amazing. The albums have been longer and longer with each release, but the songs are just amazing. I have taken the time to go back and listen to some of these songs and some of these albums that I didn't necessarily like, and I have been able to pick out one or two things here from each album and actually appreciate it. Some songs that people like, I still can't get into. That would be The Reincarnation of Benjamin Breek. But in most cases, the albums are great. I mean, Senjutsu's great. The Book of Souls is great. Final Frontier is better than a lot of people give it credit for. I think personally, Matter of Life and Death, people give too much credit to, but that's just my opinion. I know I will probably be slapped left and right when people hear that. But Brave New World is great. Dance of Death is great. I mean, it's anything but. Excuse me. You can't say anything really bad about what Iron Maiden has done since the reunion era, and I call it that because it's now a 6-piece band, 3 guitarists, and the bassist and drummer and singer. It is such a different dynamic now, but at the same time, it's so cool to see this on stage, and I like what they have done as a business arrangement, if you want to put it that way. Whereas because they take so much time in between albums, what they do now is that they will release an album, tour on that album, and they will do a tour which is basically more of the modern Iron Maiden stuff or reunion era recordings with a little hint here and there of the classic Iron Maiden. So you'll get a tour with mostly songs from the reunion era with maybe a Wrathchild, the Iron Maiden song, the self-titled song, and then like maybe 1 or 2 other songs. But the set list is a majority of the modern era songs. And then they've done the in-between tour. They do what they call and they don't call it a nostalgia tour, but they call it the classics kind of tour. And they've recreated the Power Slave tour, the Seventh Son tour, and then just recently, this last one was, the Legacy of the Beast tour, extremely successful, basically celebrated every era. And I really think that really, really came across very well. You and I went to see the show. It's amazing. They are still touring on Legacy of the Beast only because they had these tour dates already planned out. Although this current United States tour that they have, I don't think it should have been part of the Legacy of the Beast, but they were so popular, that tour, that they're now playing places that they didn't play last time to fill in some of the gaps. And then at the end of this year, I think it finishes this year, 2022, 2023, they're going to come out and they're going to tour on Senjutsu, finally. Mm-hmm. Although they are playing a couple of tracks from Senjutsu now. So the Legacy of the Beast, whoever's catching the United States version of Legacy of the Beast, and whoever caught a couple of the shows from the festivals over 2022, we're catching the Senjutsu songs that have been added to the set list. And some of the drums have changed, so there's pictures now with Senjutsu and stuff like that. But still, for the most part, the Legacy of the Beast. So, I mean, what else is there to say about Iron Maiden? They have literally, I would want to say, with the reunion era, they reinvented themselves. They're more progressive, longer songs. But at the same time, there's still classic Iron Maiden, So it is just incredible to watch and see how far they've come from the new wave of British heavy metal to now. And yeah, they had that little lull in the 90s like everybody else did. But they persevered and they got through it, and here they are today, probably bigger than ever.
I'd say, I mean, at least as big, because it also depends on what part of the world that you go to, because the U.S. obviously is not as strong in the metal fandom anymore, I guess. But you go other places in the world, and they're just as big as they ever were, and that's more than just Iron Maiden we're referring to. I mean, that just metal in general. You go to Europe, and Wacken Festival is just still massive, and that's great to see. I'd love to go see Wacken at some point.
I would love to, but I at the same time I think to myself, I'm getting too old for this shit. Because you literally go there, you got to camp. I mean, otherwise you're staying miles away, and I don't know if I'm up for that, but it would be an amazing experience if I ever went to Wacken.
Yes. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of these bands, like we said, disappeared and then came back. But a few of them survived this whole time. Girl School, Saxon, Iron Maiden, to varying degrees. But the fact is they're still putting out music, and there's a lot of stuff that, even if it's a band that you didn't like one incarnation of or something like that, there's still stuff to find. There's always new music to explore, and I'm just glad that these guys are around doing their thing. So,
to kind of bring this all to a nice little bow tie, the funny thing is about my rants that I just had today. Chris and I, at the time that we're recording this last night, we went to see Accept in concert. Okay, now everyone's going to sit there and say, "Wait a second, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, you're a hypocrite," because we went to see Accept, and Accept only has one original member, Wolf Hoffman, or one member from the classic lineup of Accept, Wolf Hoffman. I get it. I understand that. I'm not saying that Wolf should have done something different. Here's the thing. At the time that Accept reunited in 2009 after being apart for so long, they had Herman Frank, who had played on Balls to the Wall, and they had Peter Baltus, the original, or the original bass player for Accept. So there were two people from the original band, and then there was Herman Frank, someone who played on a classic lineup of Accept. And they brought in a new singer because obviously Wolf and Udo could not get along. It wasn't going to happen with Udo. So they brought in Mark Tornillo, who is an extremely talented vocalist who sounds so much like Udo. And then, of course, they brought in a different drummer.
He does, but he also has a very unique voice of his own, which I appreciate. Like, he sounds like, or he doesn't sound like Udo per se, but he has similar tone, I would say.
Right. So regardless, I'm not trying to say that Wolf should have done something different, but at the time, he owned the name, and he was the main songwriter. Those songs are his. He wasn't the lyricist, but the music was his. So I give him that much credit, because bottom line is the band was not going to continue if they weren't called Accept, and the band wasn't going to continue with Udo. So they forged their name. They've established themselves as Accept, with Mark on vocals, with Wolf on guitar. So this new era that started in 2009 of Accept is what is currently out there. Okay, so yes, the band now is Mark and Wolf, and they've had different musicians since that point. And now they're a 6-piece band, just like Iron Maiden, with 3 guitar players. So now they're 2/6, or you want to put 1/3 American. The guitar player, what's his name? Schaus. I can't remember his first name now. He is American from Alabama. Mark is an American from New York. And then you've got the rest of the guys from Germany. So my point being is, I ranted a lot about these bands that got a million different members coming in and out of the band. And Accept has been part of that as well. But in essence, the whole bow tie is this. We've spoken about the successes, the non-successes, and the people, the has-beens or should-have-beens or never made it anywhere. All the music during this time period, the new wave of British heavy metal, was pretty damn good, pretty amazing. And it is a period of time that you look back with some nostalgia, and you look back with some pride, you look back with a gleam in your eye. And then in 2000, the resurgence said, you know what? I can still listen to this. I still can go see this. And that's the cool thing. You know what? For what it's worth out there, a lot of these bands that are still trying to make it or still trying to put out a product, you know what? Go see them, because at least you're getting to see something. At least you're getting to see these bands, any band, these musicians put on a show for the music that we like and listen to all the time. So, yeah, it may sound hypocritical, but it more about kind of picking on one or two bands that should have just wrapped it up and not come back. But for the most part, it's the time of life to celebrate this music and enjoy it for what it's worth. I that's what I have to say about it. What do you got as a final word?
I mean, in the similar vein, I guess the same thing. Some of these bands put out some crappy albums. Let's just be honest. But for the most part, even if they put out some crappy albums, there's some good stuff in there. There's not many of them we talked about that just didn't have anything worth looking into. So I think there's a lot of people who get into this mindset of, I either like a band or I don't. But I don't think that's the way to think about it in a lot of ways. Like, sometimes a band has one album that's amazing. And that's all that's necessary. Listen to that album. Enjoy that album. You don't have to be so set on I like this band and I like everything they do, because sometimes bands put out crappy music, but it doesn't mean you can't wear their t-shirt or go to their show or enjoy what they put out. So just be a little bit more open-minded. I will say that doing this podcast, I've found a lot of music that I never thought I would enjoy because I didn't think a band was all that great or whatever, but then I ended up liking them a lot. So, the new wave of British heavy metal has kind of gone under the radar to me as a concept sometimes. I like a lot of bands that were part of it, but I never really thought of it as a whole. And I found some of the bands we talked about in the first episode, and I said, wow, this is somebody I've never even heard of, and this is kind of a cool album. Like, Kenneth and I make jokes about Clovenhoof all the time, because it's kind of silly, right? But that first album is actually worth checking out. So, open your mind and check out some good music.
So one last thing before we close this out and we head into our big four new wave of British heavy metal bands. I did want to mention that, while I was researching this, I obviously was looking at some compilation CDs and some albums and stuff like that I wanted to share with you guys listening out there. So if you guys want to get your own copies of it or get your own version of whatever it is, put together your own compilation, I wanted to let you know about a few compilations that I am aware of. So the first one is called The New Wave of British Heavy Metal 79 Revisited. That was compiled by Lars Ulrich. It contains tracks from Diamond Head, Zaxxon, Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, Girl School, Tigers of Pantang, Sledgehammer, Gaskin, Angel Witch, Blitzkrieg, Witchfinder General, Fist, Praying Mantis, Vardis, Holocaust, Jaguar, Raven, and Sweet Savage. There's a lot of bands on there. It's a 2 CD set. It is actually out of print, but a few years ago, they released it or re-released it on vinyl. So it's hard to get, but it is available out there. You could probably get it through the usual aftermarket sellers, or what do they call those? Secondhand
resellers,
the resellers. So it's available through eBay. You can get it through Discogs or other used channels like that. But the album highlights some of the better bands from that era. So that's really cool. Another one that's out there is called Lightning to the Nations. They're so original with these titles. Lightning to the Nations, New Wave of British Heavy Metal 25th Anniversary Collection. It actually spells NWOBHM more than the whole thing out there. And that is a very extensive compilation featuring the usual suspects, a lot of the bands that we've already talked about, along with some of the rarer bands such as Ethel the Frog, Girl, Quartz, Tyson Dog, Lone Wolf, Tarot, Steel, and several other bands that we have not mentioned over these 3 episodes, but are still part of that scene. That to me is the next best compilation after 79 Revisited. That one is also out of print. It's hard to get, but you can get it through eBay, Discogs, or the other used channels. And then there are two more. One is called NWOBHM, New Wave of British Heavy Metal Initials. It's a compilation consisting of, like I said, the usual suspects. That one is currently available through Amazon. That is just a straight up name for it, NWOBHM. And that, again, contains a lot of the people that we've talked about over these past 3 episodes. And finally, one thing that we I don't know if we touched upon it or not, but I know I was listening to it while we were talking about the first episode, is the Neat Singles Collection, volumes 1 through 3. That is an extremely extensive collection of new wave of British heavy metal songs that were all released by Neat Records between 1979 and 1987. It is extremely rare to find right now. It is out of print, available through all the usual, eBay resellers, eBays, and all, and Discogs. But that one's really unique because it also, I mean, besides all the singles, I mean, just think about all the singles that they released of all these bands that were on Neat Records. I mean, there's stuff from Venom on there. There's stuff from Raven on there. So it's got some pretty famous bands that basically got signed off of Neat Records. So there's a lot of cool things on there, a lot of hard to find stuff out there that you can't get anymore. It's on this collection. So that's pretty cool. So
pretty cool.
Yeah, so I think all these things, if for anybody who wants to listen to this stuff, it's out there. I mean, besides consuming it on Spotify and Apple Music and Google Music or whatever it is that you listen to, these are, if you want to get your hands on something, this is what you want to get your hands on. So, all right, well, after basically 6 hours and 3 episodes, we're down to the last of the big fours based on this series. We're at the big four of the new wave of British heavy metal bands. So we picked Zaxxon the first last time, and I believe it was Zaxxon the first time, Diamond Head the second time, and now we're going to come around with picking our big four bands from this era. I believe I've gone first a couple times. So why don't you go ahead and go first on this one?
Okay. This really wasn't that hard for me. My number 4, I'm going with Diamond Head. So, yeah, we talked about some of that middle stuff was not that great, but that first album was really impactful for me. I had it on CD for a long time. Now, kind of funny story, I was taking it out of my CD player, and after searching for that album and, finally finding a copy, and I was excited, I listened to it a lot, and, I was taking it out of the CD player, it snapped in half, and I was just bummed out, and I couldn't find another copy. I went back to where I bought it, Diamond Head Records, funny enough, which is no longer around today, which is sad, but that was my record store when I was a kid. So I went back there, couldn't find a copy, and I got home, and I was just bummed out, and there was this horsefly flying around my office at home, and it was just bothering my sister. And I wasn't even looking. I did the coolest thing I've ever done, and I'm sorry, PETA people that are listening to this, but I took half the CD without even looking, and I sliced the fly, got it like against the bookshelf, and I was like, how did I even do that? So Diamond Head, took out a horsefly. But my number 3 is Angel Witch. They're a band that I was aware of for a long time, but over time, they've really grown on me. And the new era of music, really pretty much everything they've done, I actually really enjoy. There's very distinct eras of the band and sounds because, you'd break up and reform and this and that. But I really like pretty much everything they've done. They're a great band and, definitely worth checking out. I think all 5 albums. My number 2 kind of surprised me because it's a band I don't often specifically think of, but their history, their continuity, just being around and waving the banner of NWOBHM, I think is just important, and that's Zaxxon. I'm more of a fan of the newer stuff, as I mentioned previously. But those early albums are really classic, and hopefully someday I get to see them because I've never seen them live. But just amazing catalog, great continuity, a band that, even though they delved into a little bit of different stuff, more commercial in the 80s, but like for the most part, they've stayed really consistent. They never went outside the bounds and said, we need to put out a thrash album, or we need to put out a grunge album, or, you know, something like that. They have just stayed true to themselves, and that's amazing. And my number one, it's got to come as no surprise. It's Iron Maiden. I've mentioned many times that they're my favorite band, or one of my favorite bands. So I don't think I need to go into more detail on that, but Iron Maiden is my number one.
All right. That's a pretty cool list. Not surprising, but at the same time, a little different from mine. We actually have 50% crossover, so you will get to hear mine now. My number 4 pick is Girl School. And the reason I picked Girl School is because they have basically been there from the beginning all the way up until now. Not much change. I mean, they had a little bit of change when they tried to be a little more commercial in the 80s, but, you know, who didn't out of all these bands? So they didn't find the success they were looking for, came back to England, and basically have maintained themselves ever since then. Number 3 for me, oddly enough, even though I kind of ragged a little bit about one of their members or former members, Tigers of Pantang.
Oh, I thought you were going to say
Oliver Dawson Saxon. That's 2 members of their band.
No, I didn't actually think you were going to say that, but
no. Tigers of Pantang. Basically, they finally figured themselves out after that whole period. I mean, you have the first 2 albums really good. The third one, okay. They kind of lost themselves in the middle there, and it took all the way till 2016 to really figure out who they were. They've done a good job with that, so I give them that credit. So they're my number 3 NWOBHM band. Number 2 for me is Saxon. Just like your number 2, they've remained steady through all these years and have flown the flag for NWOBHM, flown the flag for metal. They've gone heavy. They've gone soft a little bit. Again, another band that tried to get commercial in the 80s and kind of left it behind. So kudos to them for still being around to this day. And last but not least, my number 1, same as your number 1, Iron Maiden. What else can be said? I mean, they are just simply amazing, and they continue to get better. So that's crazy to think about.
All right, that's a good list.
All right, well, that's our big 4 new wave of British heavy metal bands, and that's the end of the series, and that's the end of this week's show. So remember, click like or subscribe, download the show on your favorite podcast platform, and you get to listen to us all the time whenever you want.
And don't forget you can interact with us by commenting on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or you can send us a DM as well. If you listen to us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment, or you can send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. So remember to tune in to the next episode when we spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of myself and Kenneth, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.